And so now Christ is in prison, and the inquisitor comes down and says to him, well, you're probably wondering why we threw you in prison, especially given that we're the members of the, we're the representatives of the church that you hypothetically founded. And Christ remains silent through this entire episode. And the inquisitor basically says, look, you laid down this ethic it's wonderful, but it's superhuman. No one can do it. It's asking way too much. And so the burden you put on people was just far too great. And so what we've done in the Catholic Church in the centuries since the church was founded is we've lightened the load. We've said, well, we take ordinary people and say, well, here's some things you can do to be a little bit better. And, we've instituted confession and repentance and all that. We've kind of toned it down so that the average person has some hope of progress. And we're making headway. And the last bloody thing we need around here is you coming back and like screwing up all our good efforts. It's like, it was nice to have you around once, but once was plenty, man. We don't need you around anymore. And so Christ listens to this, doesn't say anything, and then the inquisitor turns to leave, and Christ grabs him and kisses him on the lips. And the inquisitor turns white and then leaves, and when he leaves the door open. And that's the end of the story. And it's an amazing story. It's an absolutely remarkable story in every possible way. And Dostoevsky was objecting to some degree to the tyranny of the Catholic Church, or even of the Christian Church for that matter. But the thing that he did that was so damn brilliant is that he even made the inquisitor leave the door open. And as a balanced critique of Catholicism, even during the Inquisition, it's so brilliant. It's so emblematic of Dostoevsky's take on the world that he criticized the inquisitorial aspect of Christianity, and of course it's the tyrannical aspect of any belief system, but noted that they bloody well left the door open, right? So it's brilliant. It's brilliant. It's remarkable. So anyways, the whole point that I'm making here is that there are terrible impediments to enlightenment, and the impediments are the necessity of sacrifice and the necessity of the voluntary acceptance of suffering. I mean, you see that in Buddhism, because one of the canons of Buddha, one of the fundamental principles of Buddhism is that life is suffering and that attachment makes it worse. And well, it isn't precisely attachment. It's attachment to things such that you cannot release the things when it's time to let them go, right? So like you're a phoenix. You're 100 years old. Your feathers, they're not working anymore, right? You're all wrinkly. You're done. It's time to burst into flames and be reborn. But you don't want to burn off your feathers. You want to cling to them. And that's not good, because you have to be willing to undergo that transformation process. And that involves, if you take yourself apart because you've made a mistake, and you find out what it is about you that's not set up properly, and that's why the mistake occurred. That's really going to happen, for example, when an intimate relationship breaks down. Then you have to be in a position where you're willing to let the errors that are part of your character, that define you, right? They might even be part of your identity. You have to be willing to let them go. You have to be willing to let them burn off. And that's a hell of a thing to ask. And so then the question might be, well, is there a less radical solution to the problem than crucifixion and resurrection, or the total immolation and regeneration? Because that's the archetypal, that's the archetypal end point, that if you want to put yourself together, you have to die and be reborn. I mean, that motif comes up all the time in popular stories and in mythology. And so here's how I think that problem can be resolved. So let's go back to the Pinocchio story momentarily. So what happens, and the Pinocchio story to me is analogous in its structure to the Sermon on the Mount. And so I'm going to make a parallel between those two things. So basically what the Sermon on the Mount suggests is that you should conceptualize the highest good that you're capable of conceptualizing and orient yourself towards that. And that having done that, you should live in the moment. So it's not like you should live in the moment. It doesn't say that, because that's often Christ the hippie, So the hippies who have adopted that, or that element of Christianity say, well, you live for the moment, and in meditation and other practices, some of the attempt is to get you to live in the moment. But just to tell people to live in the moment. It's like, what the hell kind of advice is that? Well, what about the future? You know, that is not helpful advice. Somebody comes to you and they're suffering dreadfully because, you know, their mother has Alzheimer's and they're unemployed. Well, live in the moment. It's like, that's just not helpful. And because it's even worse than that, it's judgmental. You say, well, the only reason you're suffering is because you haven't oriented yourself properly to live in the moment. It's like, no, you're suffering because your mother has Alzheimer's and you don't have a job. It's like, it's not because you aren't living in the moment. So living in the moment isn't the right answer. The right answer is something more like, orient yourself towards the highest good that you can imagine, and then act in the moment. That's a whole different story. Now that's what happens in the Pinocchio story. Basically what happens is that Geppetto sees the star beckoning in the distance, and he orients himself towards the highest good he can imagine. He wants to take this creation of his, and so this is manifesting itself conceptually at multiple levels simultaneously, because there's a story about the destiny of humanity in relationship to God nested in the story. It's like, take your fallible creation, your puppet, and set up the conditions such that it's capable of taking on full functional independence. It's something like that. So that's what you do if you're a good parent with your children. You don't protect them, you don't offer them safety, you don't do any of that except insofar as it's necessary to facilitate their development as fully competent and courageous beings. The purpose of the protection is only to allow that developmental process to continue. So Geppetto orients himself, and so the father orients himself, and then the son undertakes the voyage. And so, all right, so let's say that that's the case. You orient yourself first. Then you can start to rely on then you can start to concentrate more on your orientation to the moment. Now, I'm going to tell you another story. So, you know, I was just watching Harry Potter the other day, the first one, and I was watching the Quidditch game. And the Quidditch game is very interesting because there's a game and a metagame going on at the same time. So the game is just the standard Quidditch game. It's kind of like basketball played on brooms, right? You have to throw balls through hoops, and if you get enough points, you win. But at the same time, so there's the normal players, and then there's two seekers, one from each team, and the seekers aren't playing the same game. The game is nested inside the seeker game, actually, because if you're a seeker and you perform your task, then everyone wins, right? You win, but everyone wins. And so you're not even playing the normal game. You're playing the seeker game. And the thing that Harry Potter chases is this thing called the snitch. And the snitch, this is one of the things that's, I don't know how the hell J.K. Rowling figured this out. I cannot figure it out, because that snitch is a winged ball, right? And there's actually a symbol of that winged ball called the round chaos, which Jung describes in his works on alchemy. And his works on alchemy are really, really difficult. It's not easy to figure out what he's talking about at all. But the round chaos, which is a winged ball, it's a manifestation of the spirit Mercury, and Mercury is an emissary of the gods. So you can think about Mercury as the unconscious manifesting itself in your field of experience, something like that. In any case, the round chaos is the container of the primordial material from which the world is made. And I think about it like this. It's this thing. There. It's that. So when you encounter an anomaly, an error, it's a container. That's a way of conceptualizing it. And what does it contain? Well, it contains, in some sense, it contains the whole world. But here's an example. Like, look, let's say, let's say that you've had repeated fights with your wife about how domestic duties are going to be arranged around mealtime. And you believe me, you're going to have those fights. And so what's happening is that mealtimes are unpleasant because there's a war for power going on in the kitchen, right? And so then you think one day, well, you're going to note that, and you're going to do an archaeological investigation and find out just what the hell is going on. And so you start unpacking the fact that mealtimes are not pleasant. And so what's in that little thing that you're unpacking, that package? Well, the entire power dynamic between men and women in the modern world is inside that dispute. And you might find that part of the reason that your wife is upset about the way that meal times are arranged is because her grandmother was beat by her grandfather, and that's playing a role in, it's played a role in determining her unconscious expectations, and that's pathologizing one of the day-to-day rituals in the house. And if you're going to unpack that, you're going to have to unpack all of that into, you take a little monster and you decompose it and you find out it's a hydra, it's got 50 heads. And then you have to work through every single one of those. It's really, really difficult. And so it's a container that contains everything. But the thing is, if you unpack it successfully, let's say, and you deal with it, you negotiate a consensus, then all of a sudden you get peace, say, around your meal times, which is a major accomplishment, man, because you have to eat 3 times a day, and it's the center of the household and all of that. So, but the thing is that often, when you're, especially in the context of an intimate relationship, things will emerge that produce discontinuities. And the question is, what should your attitude towards that discontinuity be? Well, you can punish the person for manifesting the discontinuity. That's the tyrannical aspect. Or you can let it take the whole thing apart, and that will happen. I mean, that's often how relationships end, is that a discontinuity emerges, and people get into it, and things go sideways so badly that the whole relationship descends into chaos, and people bail out of it. And so it's no wonder that people want to ignore it. And it's also no wonder that they want to tyrannize it. It's like, quit bothering me with that. Well, possibly, but probably not. And also, if my attitude towards you is quit bothering me with that, your attitude towards me when I have the same sort of problem in reverse is going to be exactly the same. And so we're not going to get anywhere with it. All right. But that still is painful. Now, let's go back to the Quidditch issue. Now, here's what happens, is that Harry Potter is picked to be the seeker. So that means he is the seeker. Whatever he represents is the seeker. And he's an interesting character because he's touched by evil, and he's a rule breaker, and he's also kind of a normal kid. He's not a hyper intellect or anything like that. That's Hermione's role, right? So he's normal, but super normal at the same time, and he gets picked to be the seeker. And then you think about what is it he seeks, and he seeks this thing that glimmers, right? It flashes in front of him. It's made out of gold, and it has wings, and if he grabs it, then he wins. And so the question is, what does that represent? Now, it's interesting that when people watch that movie, they actually find that, you know, they think that that's kind of cool, that it's a cool game. And it is a cool game. She laid it out very nicely. And the idea is that, well, there's a game, and if you play it normally, you win the game. But in that game is a metagame, and if you play that properly, then not only do you win, but everybody wins. So and then the next rule is the metagame supersedes the game. And that's the same idea that I'm chasing here with you today about this meta-morality. It's the morality that emerges as a consequence of the analysis of a set of moralities. Or it's the morality to which all other moralities should be subjugated. That's another way of thinking about it. And I said, well, that's a terrible thing because it involves painful sacrifice, or maybe it involves confronting the thing you least want to confront. That's the Jungian dictum, right? If your life isn't all that it should be, then you should find out the thing that you least want to confront that you're avoiding and confront that. And that's easy to say, but it's a terrible thing because it means you're going to have to turn your gaze to the place where you are weakest and most vulnerable. And that is asking a lot of people. So then you might say, well, is there an alternative? And I think there is an alternative. So this is the anomaly, right? This is the ball that contains everything. I think there is an alternative. I think it's associated with this idea. So imagine we could have a conflict if we were in a relationship. We could have a conflict that would blow the relationship apart. All right, so we don't want to have that conflict. And then we could have no conflict whatsoever, which means that you would never get to say what you wanted and I would never get to say what I wanted, because we're either identical, which is just not happening, or we're going to have conflict because you're going to want some things that I don't want and vice versa. So if there's no conflict, we are not in a relationship. All right, so zero conflict is the wrong amount, and conflict that destroys the relationship is the wrong amount. And then you might say, well, okay, what's the optimal amount of conflict? Well, so then we can think about how people respond emotionally. So let's say